class, I thought I'd make a video because GUIs can be difficult, especially the memorization side of things, so I want to keep what you need to memorize down to a minimum. So let's make a bare bones GUI, something very minimalist, and build up from there to see what's actually required to make something appear on the screen. What's the minimum you need to remember. So the first thing, you're going to need two things from PyQt4. We need to import from pyqt4.qtGUI, we need the following things. We need QWidget, and we need QApplication at a minimum. You don't need a main function. If you don't want one, you can just write it all out in the command line. So we need to create a QApplication and save that to something. We'll call it app. Now, QApplication's constructor needs a list of strings. The examples that I've shown you before get it from sys.argv. Sys.argv, what that is here, let me open up a command prompt. Here we go. If I were to, this is called tutorial1.py. If I wanted to invoke this at the command line, I would type python tutorial1.py, and then I could put in a list of arguments. But I'm not going to do that typically. I'm typically going to run things using the play button here in Spider. But if I were to do this, this list of arguments, let's say arg1, arg2, etc., would be passed in and be stored in sys.argv. And that could be passed into my QApplication as a list of strings. But since I'm typically not going to do that from the command line, I don't need it. I can pass it an empty list of strings, and it's all happy. We don't even need to import sys. Create that QApplication. We need to execute that QApplication. QApp.exec. All we need now is to put a widget in that application. That's the I guess the QApplication is what gets Qt started and ready to show things, but we need something to show. So we're going to create a QWidget. That doesn't need anything at a minimum for the constructor. We'll call that form. And then we need to make sure that we show it. Otherwise it's invisible. It's just an object in memory until we show it. And this is the very minimum you can get to make something show up on the screen when we press play. No Python console. Often it crashes when I'm working with GUIs because I make mistakes. And here we are. We have our GUI. You can drag it, etc., maximize and minimize if we wanted to bring it back. That's the very minimum you need to start up a GUI. Let's add to it. Usually you see that so that we could invoke this from the command line, we define a main function, put everything inside main. And then we use the Python idiom if name is main. Then go ahead and run that main function. So that's going to allow us to, if we wanted to, invoke this from the command line. So let's bring up that command line. I'm going to, let's see, switch into the right directory. So I'm just going to cd and copy paste the directory that I want to be in. Now I can type python tutorial1.py, and it starts up from the command line. So that's one thing that is usually shown in the examples that you've got. Alright, QWidgets by themselves don't do anything. We would need to subclass QWidget in order to make our own custom widget if we want it to do anything at all. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to define a new class, bare bones GUI, that inherits from QWidget. So it is a QWidget, can do anything that a QWidget can do. but it's going to be able to do a little bit more. And so instead of creating a QWidget here, I'm going to replace that with my own bare bones GUI. What's it complaining about? Expected and intended block. That's waiting for something to be written here so I can satisfy that. But let's actually write the code. So let's define the initialization method. We can call the super constructor for QWidget. Turns out, at a minimum, that's not absolutely necessary. I think it's a good idea, but I'll show you that you can get by without it. Actually, you can get by without this entirely. Let's hold off on this for a second. Let's say we just want to draw something on our bare bones widget. We don't even need to define an initializer. So you can get away without that. You do need a paint event method, and it's required to take in. We're going to override QWidget's paint event method. Whenever a paint event is fired, the signal gets sent, and this method gets called. It gets passed in this event E. I guess we can see that in the console. Let's see. Paint event. See, it takes in a Q event. That flashed up for just a second there. Paint event, QPaint event. So it's expecting that. But as usual, the first argument is typically going to be self, and then we can get that QPaint event, and I'll call it E. Typically, we're not going to do anything with it. Not with the paint event. We're going to do things with other events, like when a mouse click event, for instance, mouse press event, you're going to use that E in order to detect where on the screen the mouse was clicking, or which mouse button, etc. But we typically don't need this E for paint events. Alright, if you want to draw something on the screen, you need a QPainter. So from pyqt4.qtgui, we're going to import as well QPainter. And that is what does all the low-level drawing in Python, at least in Qt. So let's create this QPainter object. Everything that you want QPainter to do has to be enclosed within begin, which takes an argument self. The paint device is the bare bones GUI object. And qp.end. Otherwise, you'll end up with some error messages. Finally, we need to, if we want to draw a rectangle, say qp.drawRect. There are some defaults as to what the brush is, so we can get by without anything at all inside there, I believe. So if we run this program now, I think we should see probably a black rectangle filled with white. It could be black. I don't know what the default is actually. We'll find out. That starts in the left corner, top left corner, and is 100 wide by 100 tall. Let's try that. Oh, okay. Indeed. I guess by default the background isn't even white. It's just the maybe transparent, whatever the gray is that the rest of this QWidget is. Okay, but we can set the brush if we want to. qp.setBrush. And all we need to remember now is that the brush takes in a color. So a QColor. Let's import QColor as well. It says that it takes in a QBrush, but it turns out that it's a QBrush can be a QColor, I guess. I'm not exactly sure. I don't think that QColor would be a subclass of QBrush. I didn't see that setBrush method was overloaded to take in a QColor, so I'm not entirely sure how it's working, but it does, and I will roll with it. So we've got our RGB values that we need to type in here, or we can type in RGB alpha. So let's make it red, and let's make it like half transparent. I think that's gonna work, so we see a little bit of the gray in the background. Try that. Yeah, see how it's kind of a little bit transparent red. If we made it 0 transparency or 100% opacity, I believe, then it turns a fuller red. If we make it almost entirely transparent, then you see just a very faint red box, etc. So this alpha layer can make some kind of cool effects. Without that fourth argument, then it's just 255 by default, full opacity. Okay, so now we have a rectangle on the screen. Let's get rid of that method. Something else we can do with our bare bones GUI is we could make a button appear. So if we want a button, Let's go ahead and define an init function method, excuse me. So as soon as the bare bones GUI starts up, we're going to create a QButton inside it. QButton is going to be part of it. We probably could write this code down in our main function as well, but I guess I like to keep the main function very simple. And we're defining what our GUI is going to have and what it's going to do up here. The main is just getting it started. I guess it keeps things a little bit more object oriented. The minimum amount of procedural sort of stuff going on here, and then the rest is dealing with an object. It's just a style thing, and it's all right. So let's create this button. We need to remember it's called a QPushButton, and we need to tell it in parentheses its parent. Its parent is the current QWidget or bare bones GUI object. That is where it's going to live. So we're going to put in self. We can, well, just that alone, creating that button and telling him it's part of the GUI is enough that I think we'll see our button. Let's see, what's our problem here? Oh, QPushButton, it doesn't know what that is, so we need to import QPushButton. We don't need QColor or QPainter anymore, so I'll get rid of those. What's wrong now? Local variable button is assigned to not used. That's not too important. Let's see if it worked. Uh-oh. Got some sort of problem. Let's go ahead and call the initializer. I haven't tried this without calling the super initializer, so let's go ahead and do that. Let's call the superclass initializer. Remember the argument. First one is the name of the class, the subclass, and then the instance of the subclass, and dot init. Don't have to pass anything in there. And I think that should be good. Let's try that. Ah, there we go. So it turns out that in order to put a button on here, we do need to call the super initializer. We need to initialize the QWidget in order to add a button to it. So we got away for a while without calling the superclass constructor, but eventually you need to call that QWidget constructor in order to add things to it, I suppose. Alright, so here is nothing on the button. The button doesn't do anything, but it is there. If we wanted to add some text to that button, then you go to the documentation. Button.setText is what you'd find. I can put push me, and it will resize the button as needed to make push me legible. And let's say we want to move the button around. We can put it in any place we want. And by specifying the x and the y coordinates, it says it takes a Q point, but it turns out that x and y coordinates are sufficient. So I'll move it to 50-50, so it's a little way from the top corner. There we go. It's in the middle now. If we wanted to make that button actually do something, then we would connect it. It has a signal that it emits, right? And we're going to connect that to a slot. So let's define the behavior that we want. Do something will be the method that occurs when the button is pushed, and I'll just have it print something into the console. Print hello, button was clicked. Alright, that's not going to do anything on its own. We need to connect the button signal to that slot. Button dot when it's clicked dot connect that clicked signal to the slot, do something. We don't want parentheses there. We're just a reference to the function. We're not calling the function itself. That's the difference. Undefined name do something, it's actually self.doSomething, right? Because this is a method. It's an instance method. It belongs to the instance of our bare bones GUI. So let's run this. And when I click push me, we should see down there appear some text. Hello, button was clicked, etc. And close. That's all I want to show for this video. In the next one, we'll take a look at, let's see. I'll make it up as I go along. See you next time.